Thanks for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. I did want to follow up a little bit on Sana's presentation. She talked about scaling. Scaling is incredibly important. And during my presentation and during hers, I suspect in every one of them, the scaling is really important, and we always need to keep that in mind. And probably the biggest bugaboo in scaling is using the same units. Because I'm going to present, I think I've got it all ironed out because I'm using data from the past 30 years, but some of it is in tons of carbon per acre, some is in tons of carbon per hectare, there's grams per meter squared. So anytime you're looking at the literature, you're trying to do some kind of a synthesis or something, I think that's the first step, is to make sure that you get the units correct. We first started talking about 25, 30 years ago, we talked a lot about tons of carbon per hectare. We pretty much converted now to CO2 equivalents. So if you're going to try to convert CO2 equivalents to tons of carbon, then you need to use the molecular weights and do all that kind of stuff. But just make sure that you go through those things, especially if you're talking to people and giving presentations about potentials when you start scaling these things. So I'll start out with I guess a disclaimer. I'm in your program, I am no longer with NRCS. I have colleagues in the room that are no longer with NRCS. Steve. It wasn't that we got fired, we just ran out of time. So, but if you don't like something I say today, feel free to call NRCS. And complain. I think it'll make us all feel better about ourselves. So feel free to do that. I'm not going to talk just about measuring carbon today. I'm going to kind of finish up with that. But in order to actually measure anything accurately, you need to understand it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some understanding in particular. There we go. I want to start I think this is relevant for all aspects of dealing with climate change. But in terms of rangeland, this is probably the most relevant issue that we have. We talk a lot about mitigation. Everybody likes to hear about mitigation because it means there's money changing hands and all of that. But the reality is our success or failure in terms of how we deal with these ecosystems, particularly in rangelands, is going to be based around how we adapt. And adaptation is the process of adjusting to climate change. So I'm not going to talk about that today, but I just want to start out with that. I think in rangelands and really in agriculture in general, we are much more invested in the need to adapt than we are in the mitigation world. So in terms of mitigation, I want to emphasize that we want to manage rangelands if we can to increase carbon storage. But if we want to benefit from that, we have to prove it. And proving it is not the same as having a cheer for it. Proving it is numbers that people believe. So I want to do that, and I want to start out with just some critical processes. Sana did a really nice job of doing some of those, but I think part of that is that scaling and scaling those things to rangeland environments, like Steve said. We don't get to do a lot with inputs, and you have to understand what those processes are and what those principles are. Secondly, managing systems to increase carbon. When if we're gonna measure this carbon, we're really gonna have to measure the effects of management as much as we're gonna have to measure the effects of carbon. So we could easily go out there and try to measure carbon and completely miss the management thing that we're trying to measure. And then finally, we're going to need a system that credibly, number one, estimates, and secondly, documents this. And this goes back to that proving it part. So I'll cover those three things in approximately equal sections. Great figure on the brochure, by the way. I'll start with that. Only I'm not going to talk about the whole figure. I'm just going to talk a little bit about it. Great. I'll work on this mainly on the left side of this figure here and really pay most attention to this number or this value right up here. And that's net primary production. This is probably the most important thing that we have in rangelands is an understanding of net primary production. So we take that net primary production and through various processes we get that energy captured and convert that energy into biomass. That biomass then either makes a product in the form of grass or wood. It gets translocated, gets into the soil carbon part of it. So, and that soil carbon then is either lost through litter or CO2 through respiration or grazed by animals, either livestock or wildlife or microbes or whatever. So I'm going to sort of spend most of my time on the left-hand part of that going over those different processes. I'll start with these basic processes. Got a grass plant on a soil body. We love photosynthesis and growth. Okay, how many of you took biochemistry in college? Okay, do you remember how long the length of time you spent studying photosynthesis? 1 or 2 lectures? How long did you spend studying respiration? You spent a month on respiration. That's about right in terms of their importance in this cycle. But you know, we tend to focus more on that photosynthesis and growth part of it. If we want to get soil carbon, if we want to manage soil carbon in rangelands, we have to get the carbon from the plant above ground into the plant below ground. You cannot increase soil carbon below ground by growing more plant material above ground. It's got to be in the roots. So that's the process of translocation. Those roots turn over. In perennial grasses, about 50% of the roots turn over every year, just as part of the natural cycle. So we lose about half of that biomass every year, and that through the process of death and decay. That's when we get into humification and aggregation. These are the really important processes for soil carbon and retention of soil carbon. Now, this is the loss side of it, and that's decomposition and respiration. And that's where this carbon that comes in via photosynthesis and growth and gets into humification and aggregation then decomposes and then is lost to respiration. And really, I mean, it's the downside for retaining soil carbon, but it's the upside for the movement of energy through these systems, and that's what makes them work. That long-term storage involves all of those things. The main difference between rangelands and forest and production agriculture is that tillage. When you till, you expose those carbon compounds to the atmosphere, to oxygen in the atmosphere, and that increases respiration and carbon loss. In rangelands and in forests, we typically don't have that soil disturbance. So that's one thing that we've got going for us. The other thing is that carbon is in 3 forms, and these go by different names in the literature. One of them is that short term. That just is what comes in and goes out every year. It never gets into the humification aggregation chain. That medium term that changes over decades, that's what we're focused on. That's what we can manage. We're not going to stop that annual movement. We just can't do it. That medium term is what we can actually have an effect on. The long term is calcium carbonate. And we don't want to start messing with that at all. So it's hard to manage, but if you expose it via erosion, either wind or water erosion, then you can have massive amounts of carbon loss from the soil to the atmosphere. It's not organic carbon, it's in inorganic form, but it goes back into the atmosphere. So this one, what we're going to focus on is that medium term carbon that changes over decades. So scaling down, in this case, we're going to get smaller and smaller from that process. And look at this one. We start over here with clay. I'm going to talk a lot about clay today, clay particles in the soil. Yeah, this is pretty weak to be a speaker and use a 45-year-old slide. But I just haven't found anything better. This is really a nice depiction of this. So we start out with these clay plates and clay content in the soil. Very important when we start talking about potential for carbon sequestration. The bacterial debris that occurs as a part of the breakdown of those microbes, the life cycle of those microbes, starts to coat those clay platelets, and we're talking nanometers here, 10 to the minus 6. This is a really, really small process. Then we actually get up into this millimeter scale, and we start to see some of these hyphae come in. The bacteria start to form the mucilage around the soil. And these are a lot of the precursors biochemically, that we look for in the soil to see what direction we're headed. And then we get up to the part where we can actually start to see these things. The hyphae starts to grow in, roots actually start to come in and start to bind this stuff together, and we get up to a 2 millimeter crumb. And that's what we can actually see. This is where the soil carbon is incorporated into that framework of that clay, and it's actually protected from respiration and attacked by microbes. So that's really what we're trying to do. And if you think about it, this is what tillage does. Tillage breaks these things apart. And especially as we go from the crumbs up to the peds, and the peds are the things that you can actually hold in your hand and you can crush. That's what protects soil carbon. When we start to break those things down, that's when we see that soil carbon loss to the atmosphere, and that's what we try to protect. If that's my wife, I'm not here. So that's kind of that very, very small scale up to the seeable scale. And we'll mostly, for the rest of the time I'm going to talk, we'll start going up. All right, so on rangeland, we've got these processes going on, and these are the processes that are involved at a management scale that really affect these carbon fluxes. First of all, and if you know this number right here, you're probably going to be able to get about a 90% accuracy on soil carbon. And that's net primary production inputs. Precipitation, inherent soil fertility. That's the soil, the nutrients that are available in the soil. We are not going to put a lot of nutrients on rangelands. And I'll show you some real data from later on about why we don't want to do this. Economically, it's not a winner, but there's a good physical reason for it. Respiration, that thing that we lose carbon, is controlled by temperature and moisture. The same things that increase production, temperature and moisture, are the things that increase respiration. We can't decouple those things. If the soil profile stays intact, loss is limited. This is where we have some opportunities in rangelands. Extreme overgrazing, and I'm talking that soil loss, degradation, this sort of thing here, result in carbon loss. We have never advocated for extreme overgrazing at this level. That is what requires real effort, decades to almost centuries to restore that capacity. We want to avoid that. And in almost every case that we've looked at experimentally, observationally, weather overrides management on rangeland because we don't use a lot of soil disturbance, we don't use irrigation, we don't use nutrient additions. Weather is driving this thing, temperature and precipitation. And, you know, thanks to the first presentation, we know a lot about where that's headed. Yeah. I want to put this one in. It's a little bit unrelated, but I want to make sure that everybody gets this. Rotational grazing will not increase soil carbon. And if you want to argue about it, then we can argue, and I've got a lot of data. So, and more importantly, paying for rotational grazing will not increase soil carbon. What management practices do we use on rangelands? We're very limited in what we can do. I think that's okay. It's actually to our advantage. And it's to our advantage, pardon me, because it forces us to understand these processes, and it forces us to understand how nature interacts with these processes. And anytime that we do that, I think we're better managers, we're better able to measure these things, without being too hard on agronomists. Typically, agronomists, their solution is more stuff, water or nutrients. And we don't have that option on rangeland, so we have to rely on our smarts. What do we work with? We work with stocking rate. How many animals do we have out there? What proportion of that net primary productivity are we trying to put into an animal? Or allocate to wildlife habitat? Or allocate to erosion cover? Those are all part of that stocking rate calculation. And we have to make sure that we don't over-allocate that net primary production to all those different ecosystem services or functions. Distribution, obviously, we don't want to, we don't want to get the damage concentrated in one place and completely avoid another place. Season of use. This is really important. I couldn't have made the point better than the C3, C4 graph. C3, cool season grasses. C4, warm season grasses. We can manipulate livestock and we can use burning to manipulate the mix of those things. But as the climate changes and gets warmer and drier, we're going to shift more towards C4 grasses. C4 grasses are probably going to respond less to that higher CO2. We can do some of this, but we're very limited again in trying to manage that species composition change, and that does have some feedback to net primary production. As we get warmer and drier, we're going to be better off with C4 grasses because they're better able to deal with it. As we move north and up in elevation, we obviously want to try to manage for C3 because they're better able to take care of take advantage of the moisture when it's available. And drought response. This is a big one. This is where we lose carbon in rangeland. Poor drought response. This is where we see degradation occurring, is during droughts. This is where we see carbon lost, and we can't make that up during non-drought periods, which are becoming less and less frequent now. Again, I'll put that one in there because I want you to get this one. Rotational grazing will not increase soil carbon.
You always skip over that really quick. Are you going to talk more about that?
I'm gonna pound you with that one. Okay, I'm gonna pound you with that one. Okay, here we go. Does grazing matter? And we've done this. We got some great experiments by some really good scientists. And this is just a short sampling. Okay, this one on the left here is a study that Richard Teague did. He's a professor at Texas A&M. I've written a couple of papers with him, although we disagree vehemently about what it all means. This is an experiment that he did in northeast Texas. So 35, 40 inches of rain a year. And he looked at some areas that had been heavily grazed for 30 plus years, some areas that had been rotationally grazed for 30 plus years, and some areas that had just been moderately grazed using all these other practices for 30 plus years. The problem is, and this is a problem that as I think extension agents and advisors that you can deal with fairly effectively. On a lot of these studies, the gold standard is that we measure the properties, we do the treatments, and then we measure the properties again. This study in particular, and several of these kinds of studies, do not have a priori measurements. So we're interpreting what was out there. And we try to reconstruct those things. I think we're beyond that experimentally now. We don't need any more of these studies that don't have beginning measurements, initial conditions. So make sure that when you look at these things, you look at that. And what they found in this, and this is a really well done study. And I think our problem with these types of studies is not that they're not well done, it's that we've misinterpreted them. Not necessarily misinterpreted them in the published papers, but we misinterpret what that means for management. And in this case, the only significant differences in soil organic matter in all of those treatments was right here in that heavy continuous grazing. Now, first of all, they didn't say what heavy continuous was, but the people that did the study, been there, that was where they concentrated cattle. So it was not an economically viable treatment. There was no way you're going to graze animals that heavily. That's what it took to reduce soil carbon in rangelands. Everything else was the same. The light continuous, the multi-paddock or rotational grazing, and then the long-term exposures were all the same. Same amount of soil carbon, regardless of management, over that 30 plus years. And the other thing is that once we got below 30 centimeters, or about a foot deep soil, and these are mollisols, these are high organic matter soils in a high rainfall area, this is where you're going to really see response. That was the only differences that we got. And you had to pound that to make a difference. So that goes back to that lack of soil disturbance that I think is an advantage in managing soil carbon in rangelands. It's really difficult to reduce the amount of soil carbon in rangelands with just livestock grazing. Now, another really good one, which did measure things prior to the start of this experiment, was from a group at Cheyenne, Wyoming, Agriculture Research Service. This is 75 years of data. And they've done that. They made the initial measurements, and then over those 75 years, they did different grazing treatments. And I don't know, physicists sort of make fun of us when we get a 0.91 R squared. But as a biologist, and even worse as an ecologist and a range management specialist, I'm pretty proud of that. If you get to, when you get to that level, and what it tells you here is what's really driving soil carbon. That is percent soil carbon. What's really driving that is that percent silt and clay, the fine particles. That's what holds on to that carbon. That's what makes it resistant to break down and resistance to attack from those microbes and loss in respiration. So that's what's really driving that on both the grazed and ungrazed. And there were multiple kinds of treatments in these things over 75 years. They even wrote a paper that said, soil carbon, does grazing matter? The abstract said, in a word, no. So that's what we wind up with. And we look at all the data, and I mean, it's pretty consistent along these lines. Now, nutrient additions, does that matter? Because, like I said, we don't normally use fertilizer. Again, very well done experiment, but Steve, if you want, I'll give you these slides. Okay, okay. Yeah, feel free to argue too. If a very well done experiment, but completely misinterpreted. This is from a study in California. It's over like 2010 to 2014, where they actually took compost, added it to some plots in the Coast Range and North Central Valley. So fairly, in the Coast Range, a pretty mesic environment, although a Mediterranean climate, so no, harsh summers, extended dry periods. They also did some work in Browns Valley Experiment Station up in the Northern Valley. Longer, harsher dry season, a little bit less rainfall, but they were able to combine the results. And what we saw there is the bars are modeled values. The black dots are measured values, and that's over a 3-year period after they applied the compost. As a rule, they overestimated net primary productivity. There's the below ground biomass. Nutrient addition did not change below ground biomass. Okay, remember what I said at the very beginning. You can't increase soil carbon unless you increase root growth. So we should not be surprised if we don't see soil carbon increases in this experiment because we didn't increase below ground biomass. So we didn't increase that one. Again, they overestimated it a little bit with the models, but we're pretty good with the models here. They're not bad. They're within a standard error. Soil organic carbon didn't matter. They did a nice job of accounting for the amount of carbon that they actually applied, but even outside of that, they really didn't increase soil carbon. Again, we go back over here, okay, makes sense. But what was really important, I thought, in this experiment was right here. That's respiration, the flux. We badly underestimated respiration in a wet year, in a high production year. So the things that drive respiration in rangeland, temperature and moisture, are the things that drive growth. So we got growth, but we also got increased respiration. And more importantly to me, the model missed it completely. That's the only place the model really fell apart. And that's the century model. That's sort of the gold standard for rangeland soil carbon. Okay, so I'm going to make the point here. It doesn't look like nutrients matter. It doesn't look like grazing matters. Does vegetation matter? And when I'm talking about vegetation, I'm talking about long-term plant growth, structure, function. These are some, fortunately, again, we did some experiments at the Jornada 20 years ago, and we're able to actually look at some of these. We compared on the same soil, we measured prior to the beginning experiment on the same soil. We looked at a tobosa grass dominated site. This is a clay site, high in clay, low in the landscape, gets a lot of water run on, versus the burrow grass site. Typically burrow grass sites are sites that have been overgrazed long term. And what we see comparing tobosa to burrow grass, there's kind of the species cover, less bare ground, an increase in tobosa grass, over here a higher proportion of burrow grass. And there's the soil carbon results. The tobosa grass state in the blue versus the burrow grass state in the red, soil carbon higher in that tobosa grass state, lower in the burrow grass state. This took 50 years. This took 50 years, actually longer than 50 years. I mean, that's just how long we've been tracking it. Same thing on a standing ecological site. It's a much bigger problem for us, especially in southern New Mexico, where we've got these mesquite dunes. versus these black grasslands. Difference, the mesquite has lower soil carbon. We could increase that from, 0.10%. Not much, but the cost is beyond belief. And we don't really even know if we can do this. I mean, we'd have to kill all the mesquite, redistribute the soil, revegetate it, all that. That's too much. So I want to sort of finish up there. Ecological state change, not practice application or management action, is what's indicating soil change. So this is something that happens over 50, 60, 100 years, not something that happens over 5 or 10 years. Now, managing soil carbon by managing vegetation. This is kind of a sample landscape. If you're familiar with the Jornada and the College Ranch, there's the Donianas, there's the Organs. Here's the Jornada Basin in between. We start out on these higher slopes up here that are gravelly soils. These kind of intermediate slopes are loamy soils, and we get down to the clay soils, high clay content, high run-on. The problem is we have to manage all this together, especially when we're using livestock. Many times our management units include all of this stuff. There's the net primary production on those different landscape components, the gravelly, the loamy, the clay. Make sure you note that between here and here is an order of magnitude difference in production. We're typically at about 350 pounds per acre per year on these gravelly sites. Down here, we're over 2,000 pounds per acre per year on average. And these year to year from 1990 through 2020, that's what we're dealing with. Now, if you remember, we said net primary production is what drives that annual change in soil carbon. We're going to be up here, we're going to be down here. So if you try to run out there and measure it this year, or this year and then this year, you're going to see these big differences if you could measure it that precisely, but they don't mean anything. This is just natural variability. This is what we have to deal with. So that's kind of the problem that we're confronted with, is how do we manage these wide springs or wide differences in net primary productivity over space and over time in a way that we don't get this short-term degradation that causes soil loss, and more importantly, the long-term degradation that causes soil carbon loss. All we got to do now is take everything that I presented there, which is just skimming the surface, and figure out how to measure this in a way that is believable to somebody that, bankers. And, you know what it takes to convince bankers. We can convince speculators, but we got to convince bankers. Why do we need to do this? Number one, public trust. I mean, tax money is driving this. And if we tell people we're sequestering carbon so that we don't have to convert our vehicle fleet to electric, or we need to get rid of a coal-powered plant or something, we need to be confident that we're doing it. Also, to inform management decisions. Our producers need these things for their management decisions. Whether they're going to participate in a carbon market or not, they need to know these things, because there are trade-offs with other ecosystem services, particularly in the case of rangeland, forage production. And finally, and Sana brought that up, and I think if I could come up with one word to describe the state of soil carbon as in a larger sense, it's uncertainty. This is what we got to deal with. And I hope, based on what I showed you so far, in terms of natural variability and natural uncertainty, we are not going to get these numbers tighter. We're going to have to figure out some other way to deal with them. All right, we can measure soil carbon in a lot of different ways. This, I think, is the coolest by far, and that is real-time carbon flux measurements. Whether we're dealing with it with eddy correlation, eddy covariance towers, relatively small, kind of portable, a little bit difficult to keep maintained because they're a little bit more temporary. But they give you some pretty good numbers, and basically what they do is via this instrumentation, they actually measure what leaves the soil and goes into the atmosphere or vice versa. So they actually measure carbon flow in the atmosphere by accounting for the way the air circulates with some highly sensitive instruments. The other one, which is just a big effort that's just getting in place now, is NEON, National Ecological Observation Network, Department of Energy funded facility across multiple ecosystems, multiple places where they built these towers. And put these, and did a lot of instrumentation on these towers, you know, the usual stuff, temperature, precipitation, all the eddy correlation stuff. This one's about 3 stories tall. I have to tell you the story. I worked in Australia for a while, and we were doing this on rangeland, but just to the north of us is the rainforest. So we were getting ready to put our system in. We went up there and looked at the rainforest, and they had like 150 tall foot scaffolding. This is like painter's scaffolding with a bunch of wires on it. And they said, oh, okay, let's go up to the top. I did. I went. When you get up there, the tower's doing this, even though it's wired down. But more importantly, every tree canopy is doing this. So it's like being on a boat in the ocean. I got sicker than a dog. And they said, oh, that's okay. If you look around the base of the tower, you'll notice that the vegetation is extremely healthy because people throw up over the edge. So some of these things can be, you know, 150 feet tall if you're working on forest. And they have a footprint. In this case, the footprint there is probably 1/10 of an acre. But we are incredibly precise estimates. These are some of the numbers that came with the eddy correlation tower from a paper that was published in 2008 by some colleagues in the Agricultural Research Service GraceNet network. And these are the numbers for Las Cruces at the Jornada Experimental Range, Walnut Gulch, Arizona, at the Agricultural Research Service lab there, at Lucky Hills at the ARS lab there, hot desert grasslands, hot desert shrublands. Annual net ecosystem exchange, the amount of carbon that moves between the soil and the atmosphere. And it's one of those places where I think they reported it in grams per meter square, and I converted it to tons of carbon per hectare. So feel free to go back to the original publications and do your own calculations. The average over that 6-year period, that site lost less than 1/10 of a ton per year of carbon. That was a pretty average set of years. We actually had one year that it gained carbon, but less than 1/10 of a ton of carbon per hectare per year. And the important thing there, I think, is that only in 1 year out of 6 did we have positive ecosystem exchange. That is, we increased soil carbon, and we only did that by a very small amount. Same thing in the hot desert grassland. We did a little better there, 3 years out of 6. If you look at those years, those are the years it rained more than ever, or it rained more than it did the year before. So again, almost entirely driven, really, really small changes, wide variability, and driven almost entirely by rainfall. If we look at the same study, just an extension of that table, if we look at some other rangelands in different places, non-Colorado, short-grass prairie, which would be very similar to the eastern third of New Mexico. We did really well there. That was, if you look back at the time period, that was the year that was most like this year. Those years were very good from a rainfall standpoint, and they actually averaged about a ton of carbon per hectare per year. But even at that, I mean, they got 5 out of 5 years. They did very well. Woodward, Oklahoma, a little bit higher rainfall, only about half the time were they positive. And this has a big implication when you're trying to sell people carbon. If you have a 10-year contract and you're in the 7th year and you've only hit 3 years that you're positive, somebody's got to come up with some money. Mandan, North Dakota, mixed grass prairie, tall grass prairie. This one was interesting. They burned it right before they started. And they got some huge numbers. They had 4.5 tons of carbon per hectare per year because they burned it and they got some rainfall that year. So it did really well, stimulated the growth. But even in tall grass prairie, only half the time were they net positive. So that's, very precise. Unfortunately, these neon towers probably, eddy covariance setup probably costs $100,000. Takes about $25,000, $30,000 a year to maintain. That's before you even start looking at the data. The neon towers are probably going to be $500,000. They got power with them the whole bit. They're going to take about $50,000 a year to maintain. So whatever it costs, about 10% of that is maintenance, and that's before you even look at the data. We can't afford that everywhere. We can do that in some small places to understand the process, but not really to get good large-scale estimates. So how do we do that? Well, this is the old soil scientist part of it, dig a hole. There is no substitute for digging holes to measure soil properties. These are some old numbers that I did, but just to give you an example, always the biggest cost in measuring anything extensively in agricultural land is going to be the cost of getting to the site. You spend an hour or two getting to the site, 15 minutes taking the sample, and you can take more samples if you want to, but that just reduces the spatial extent that you're sampling. So that's going to cost money, $2 to extract a sample. Preparation's still going to, and this is incredibly important to do this correctly. Chemical analysis in labs is going to take $10, $15 a sample. Statistical analysis, about $1 a sample. But again, we haven't even really started interpreting the data yet. We have come up with some better ways to do things over the last 20 years. This is a project I worked on with some colleagues at Los Alamos. I think they've all gone on to bigger and better things now. This is a laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy. I think we had some people in engineering at NMSU that still do a lot of LIBS work. We've come up with near-infrared spectroscopy. And what we found in these things is that, yes, you can do this in the field, but you still have to prep that sample. You still have to make sure that what you're pointing that thing at is what you want to measure. And again, you still haven't started to interpret it yet. You get a lot more data that way, but it's still pretty expensive. Now, the problem there becomes spatial variability. This is from an old study in Michigan. Phil Robertson and his group this is a 10-acre field. This is where they sampled. That's how many samples they took. This is what they measured for carbon and how they mapped carbon based on that sampling. And you see these huge, very changes in soil carbon over relatively small distances. And that's because of this underlying structure that you don't necessarily see. This field had been farmed for 100 years with plowing. So you're not going to find a more homogeneous field than this, and we still saw these kind of differences. So where do you sample? How do you sample a field like that to get an answer about how much carbon is in that field? Over here.
This was cropland. Is it now rangeland?
No. This is still cropland. This is an experimental field at Michigan State. It's still cropland, and that's still the kind of numbers that you get. And this is microtopography that has accumulated over eons. But, and it's so small that you really can't recognize it. But here's the curve. You're going to need about 60 samples in that 10-acre field to actually get that curve to flatten out. Again, not going to happen. It's too expensive. So how do we estimate carbon change over time, and particularly over management time? How do we see if our management is working? We're looking at soil carbon changes that are certainly less than 1 ton of carbon per year. Soil carbon stocks are vary greatly, anywhere from 100 to 400 tons of carbon, so the background noise is really high. We want to detect a change of 1%, and if you look at that, if you remember these graphs that I've been showing you, 2 or 3% soil carbon is pretty high. So a 1% change is an increase of a half to a third. That's a lot. If we wanted to do it at a 95% confidence level, that's what it takes to compete with power plants that have things they put on smokestacks to measure. That's what we can measure. We're 99% confident on vehicle emissions. 5 years, it's impossible. If you're going to try to measure carbon over 5 years, that's impossible. 20-year, we're going to need 20 samples per soil series and field. Not going to happen. So how do we credibly estimate changes in soil carbon on large areas over a relatively short period of time? We go to process modeling. And this is just the subroutine in Century. But if you notice, it starts with net primary productivity. That's the only input into this submodel. That's why it's so important. This is kind of the standard. This has been around for 50, 60 years now. It's really a good model. And you can, I think, look at it and say, if we can't do it with this, then we're probably not going to get a lot better fast. But that's the flow diagram there. And this thing actually winds up with the active. That's the annual, the slow, that's the decadal change. And then that's the passive, or the calcium carbonate. Net primary production, rainfall, inherent soil fertility. That list I gave you when we first started, that's it. Temperature change. Okay, we did some of this in a DOE-funded project about 10 years ago. Collaborated with Los Alamos. We collaborated with some Department of Energy, some guys at New Mexico Tech. It was really a fun project. And we did it on these areas here just to give you an idea about how we do this for New Mexico. Just like Sara said, this is what we're going to have to get into to actually see what our priorities are going to be and how we're going to do it. In New Mexico, we got about 78 million acres total. 50 million acres of that are non-federal land. 28 million acres of federal BLM, Forest Service, Park Service land. Cropland about 1.5 million. Conservation Reserve Program, 400,000 acres, but declining quickly. Pasture, 500,000. Rangeland, by far the biggest. 41 million, forest, 5 million. The colors there are rainfall, precipitation. So just as an example, we use Major Land Resource Area 70. That's this sort of pale green area here, represents where there's the most potential in terms of rainfall, where the soils are largely mollisols, relatively fertile soils. So we just ran some scenarios using the Century model to see what we could do. There's about 600,000 acres or 600,000 hectares of rangeland in there. Management's going to get us less than a ton of carbon per hectare per year. That's assuming that we have an average climate. So not bad. The addition of legumes and restoration, much better, except we don't have those technologies. The cost of trying to establish legumes on existing rangeland is not particularly high if you hit it the first time, but we never hit it the first time. So double it, triple it. That's a technology that has promise, but we don't have. Cropland, if we take irrigated corn and convert it to perennial grass, we get a pretty good boost in soil carbon, as you might expect. But economically, that's going to be a tough sell. If we go cropland, small grain to perennial grass, that's really good. And that's why CRP has done so well, and why we've seen such good carbon numbers come out of CRP. Unfortunately, in this system, because it's so dry, we don't get a lot from no-till. And I think part of that is we're limited in response because of climate, and people that report no-till aren't really doing no-till. They're doing no-till 9 years and tilling 1 year. So they're 90% no-till, but that 1 year is when you get all the volatilization, respiration. And we've typically, as we've done more of this work lately, we've seen these no-till numbers come back very disappointing. People adopt minimum tillage or no tillage, they're just not boosting those soil carbon levels, even in the Corn Belt. They're just not getting those numbers up very well. So we've got a tool that we can use online to do this based on Century. It's called Comet. Worked on this many, many years ago. The front end has been greatly improved. The underlying model is Century, so it's still about the same as it was 25 years ago. If I ran it just as an example for Union County, New Mexico, which I kind of thought would be on rangeland, it would be the best opportunity we had. If we use prescribed grazing, improving management on non-irrigated 0.08 of a ton per acre per year, that's not measurable. Even over a 20-year period, that's below our detection limits. The big boost here came from nitrous oxide. I don't know where the hell they got that number. I don't know how you sequester nitrous oxide in a rangeland system. The important thing there is right here. That red number is the bottom limit of estimate. That blue number is the upper limit. That's too big a range. You cannot sell that. If you sell that, there's got to be a huge amount of risk management involved. So, a little bit about risk management. I worked with Chicago Climate Exchange. In the 2010s, I was on an advisory committee that helped them set up their rangeland offset program. We ran the thing using degraded rangeland versus intact rangeland based around grazing management, series of 4-year contracts, relied heavily on aggregators to actually put projects together to get enough tradable units that they could go to an exchange. They're not interested in 50, 60 tons of carbon per rancher per year. They want millions of tons in these contracts. And we had to solve the problem quickly and cheaply. So the way we did it was we took an existing land classification system called land resource regions that we use in soil survey. USDA uses this for programs, so widely accepted, widely accessible. We took the literature and we looked at these areas and assigned values. We developed regression equations, assigned some values to them. And this thing was mainly based around long-term, well-managed rangeland that avoided carbon losses during drought. We didn't figure we were going to sequester carbon. We figured we were going to keep carbon in the soil during drought. Those are the numbers that we came up with in tons of carbon per acre per year because we were trying to get ranchers to sign up. We converted that to acres. Again, relatively small numbers. If you look at land resource area D there, we didn't even do an estimate there because that area is typically under 10 inches of precip a year, and that's just too unreliable for a 10-year contract. We did pretty well over it here, but we actually did have some ranchers that participated up here around Newkirk and up in that area. And they did pretty well. They did what they were supposed to. They got the money they were supposed to. When it was all over, the folks at the Chicago Climate Exchange said, we don't think we can handle this. It's too risky and we don't have a place to go with the risk other than a huge portfolio. So, you know, we need some work. These large land areas, just like Sana said, in high radiation, low rainfall, it's really difficult to generate those net primary production values like we need. It's all based around restoration technologies that we don't really have yet, that need work, and are going to be increasingly unlikely to come up with as the climate changes. Private sector needs some new risk management tools. These guys, I think, did a really good job on it. Steve Ogle and some colleagues at Colorado State just came out with a report at the end of 2022, the greenhouse gas report for agriculture. There is CO2 grazeland, remaining grazeland, very small estimate on potential, but look at that lower bound and upper bound. That's what's intolerable. This number is, we can live with that number in a marketplace, but we can't live with these numbers. Enteric fermentation is a much bigger deal. That's what, you know, if we're gonna emphasize what we can do or prioritize what we can do, enteric fermentation, manure management, nitrous oxide from manure management, those are much more likely, and they are not sequestration, they are emission reduction. So you don't have to go back and check on them every year. That's a every year. Once you have an emission reduction, you can sell it. Hang on, Steve, I'm finished. All right. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Yeah. I hope I got finished on that.